Hello, everybody. Welcome into another edition of Analytics Unplugged, our healthcare edition of that. I'm Bill Stinneford alongside Peter Healey. We'll get into some more about growth today, specifically Greenfields versus Whitespace and some strategies and some best practices, and we'll talk about that. But summer's winding down. In the last episode, you still have not trimmed your beard. So everybody on the poly market that bet no shaving, they won money.
Taking the lawn.
And I think it's because you're able to keep the beard, because we have actually not had a tremendously hot summer in North Texas, which is, I think they said the other day, we've only had 3 100-degree days, whereas at this time now we're here at the end of August or middle of August, there's already been like 20. So otherwise, I think you'd just be going crazy.
Yep.
Yeah. Kids are almost back in school, and
we're getting back to a schedule, and that
wives are celebrating. Yes. So, well, good. Everything good?
Yeah. Excited to be here.
All right. So we'll talk about, we've been talking about growth. Obviously, there's been, the market continues to be strong. As we're recording this on, middle of August, as I said, there's more and more confidence that interest rates will start to drop in September when the Fed meets again. And as we've talked about, that is something that can really springboard growth, especially on things like de novo, new construction of centers. So the market seems to be very resilient. And if interest rates drop, you could really start to see some of this that we've been talking about in previous episodes really come to the fore. And so what's your plans? Right? Even when it looked a little dire or confusing, you got to be planning. That's what we talked about, because things can change on a dime. So now that things look to be more favorable to growth, these are some of the things that we'll get into. So some questions that we get from our clients or prospects when you talk about growth, there's terms that get thrown around a lot. Whitespace, we talked about de novo versus acquisition growth right before, but Whitespace, Greenfields, some people would say they're the same thing. Some people say they're different. What would you say? How would you explain what a greenfield is and what a white space is, and where do they intersect and how are they different?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a topic that comes up, and you're absolutely right that, I think the outlook for the back half of the year continues to get brighter and brighter. We're hearing more and more from private equity saying that they all expect an uptick in deal volume here as we make it through the back half of 2025. And so that certainly is reflected in the conversations we're having today with prospects and clients alike. To really get down to it, and I think a lot of these terms, depending on the organization or just who you're talking to, there's a ton of overlap between them. When we really break it down, I think there are a couple key differences to consider. So first, white space, very simply put, typically does account for competition in existing, or think developed, markets. So big cities, finding where those growth opportunities exist is typically how we think about the definition of white space.
Okay.
A greenfield, on the other hand, is, like the name suggests, truly undeveloped at this time. So think the outer edges of large markets that are growing, or small markets that are starting to experience more and more development within them. But the bottom line is, when we're talking about true greenfield, nothing exists in that space today, whereas a white space does have existing development there. Both ultimately still yield tons of growth opportunities, but very simply put, that's how we tend to break down the difference in the terminology between the two.
Okay. And so why is it important to make that distinction if you're a healthcare company and you're thinking about your strategy that way?
Sure. So one of the things that you first have to be able to answer is, how important is it to be a first mover in terms of that first mover advantage when it comes to setting up shop or hanging your shingle wherever it is that you want to grow? So if you know that you really do want to get a bunch of new movers from a household perspective into an area that don't have a provider today, think your dentist, your vet, your primary care doctor. So when you move to a new house, chances are that it's farther away from those established providers that you have. And unless you're really good friends with them, you're probably going to start to look for some other options. And so knowing if you are that fill in the blank first mover advantage type of provider, that you've got a great pad site in a brand new, shiny, grocery anchored shopping center, well, that is a key thing to standing up a really robust panel quickly versus going into a competitive, established market where you're going to have to fight for every single patient that you get, as opposed to having them come to you because, frankly, there aren't a ton of other options.
Right.
And so that's really one of the key things that each organization needs to be confident in. And there is no single right answer. You can do both. But when it comes to really making those choices, I think first the executive teams within those organizations need to be comfortable in terms of, well, where are we most comfortable with whichever one of those growth levers we want to pursue.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because you really do have to answer that question, right? Do we need to have that first mover advantage? Sometimes you're trying to get ahead of the competition, but if you truly had analytics that help you not only take into account competition in your forecasting of how a new site will perform, but you can also understand cannibalization to your existing locations, right? How close is too close? And that's a fear for a lot of people when they think about, to use Whitespace as your definition, I'm going to add new locations into an area where I have some footprint already. Sometimes people worry about getting too close because they don't have the insights, the data, the analytics to be able to understand that. And that always leads to a fight internally, right? Because, inevitably there's a group in your organization that's responsible for opening up new clinics or new hospitals or whatever it is. And their bonus structure is probably incentivized on adding more locations. And then you also have somebody that's probably heading up operations that's incentivized in some way on, for lack of using a retail term, comp store sales gains, right? But just increases to the performance, the visits, patients in existing locations. That immediately puts people in conflict. And so that's why some people may run to Greenfields, which that's good. As we'll get into later today, you need to have a strategy for that. They overlook the opportunities that they still have within their existing markets for Whitespace, and they end up leaving that to competition.
Sure.
And one of the benefits, if you have 5 locations in a market and you have the data and the analytics and forecasting tools to be able to know how many additional locations you can put in that market and where exactly they should be without cannibalizing your existing locations too much. So where these potential locations can go, not only do you get additional locations, you ward off competitors because you are first to that new neighborhood in an existing market, but also your marketing costs in a lot of ways become a lot less. So if you have 5 locations and you're doing radio and TV as part of your strategy, which some people do.
Sure.
If now I have 10, well, the cost to do all that electronic media is still the same in that market, but now I can divide, and we've talked about this in the past, I can divide that cost amongst 10 locations as opposed to 5. When I go open up that Greenfield, and there are benefits to that as we'll talk about, but you typically are seeding it with 1 location, maybe 2, and it gets real expensive to do any of those mediums electronically in those new markets because you're only dividing it by 2. And you have to think about those types of things. So I think a lot of times organizations pass on opening up additional new locations in existing markets because they're scared of cannibalizing.
Well, to your point about internal conflict, so many organizations have doctor partners, a provider at a location who has some ownership in the organization. And as soon as they hear that, well, we're going to open up another location within shouting distance of where you're practicing today, panic ensues. You're going to take all my business. I know for a fact that Miss Betty lives 50 miles away and she comes to me every so many months for her checkups. Well, that may be true, but when you use the data to be very objective in where does your value, your panel truly originate from, often it's telling and reassuring to understand we do know what our risk for cannibalization or transfer of business is. And it's not as bad as you think. Because of course we all go to extremes
Sure.
in our heads whenever we're faced with some unknown or something that we think might have an impact on our day-to-day. And so, the list of success stories, frankly, where clients have been able to use the data to shift that conversation from I think or I feel or I fear to I know, and again, here's the data to back it up, is significant. And I think it's a game changer when it comes to just showing the actual data to make those informed decisions.
Right. I like to say it's sort of like that data acts as an unbiased flashlight that sort of breaks down the logjam of opinion, and it allows you to move with greater speed and in a very competitive market. That's important, and with more confidence. So that's some of the benefit of not passing on existing, but you also don't. There is a first mover advantage to getting to a greenfield market first. So what do you recommend to healthcare organizations to, somebody that's watching this may be, I'm in 4 markets right now. I'm not necessarily looking to go all over the country. I want to be regional for operational purposes, but there might be 6 major metros that they could go to efficiently from an operational perspective. How do you choose? Like, what makes one a high value market versus the other? What are some of the tools, or what are some of the things that you think that people should do to be able to answer that question? And then once they answer it, what to do next?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first answer to that is fundamental to how we've operated for 31 years, and that is first and foremost, do I have enough of the right type of people in close proximity to where I want to operate? And maybe depending on what kind of business model or what type of medicine you're practicing, that size varies. If you are an urgent care, if you are a vet, a dentist, a primary care doc, yes, it's good to prioritize one market over another at the market level. But in reality, what's going on the south side of Atlanta has nothing to do with what's going on the north side of Atlanta, because if you've ever been stuck in Atlanta traffic, it might take a day to make it from one part of the market to the other. And so thinking about that, if you have to break down market to market comparisons, yes, do I have enough of the right type of people in this market is the first place that we would typically advise starting. And again, the right type of people is not just demographics. It's certainly not total population, but within that, who really most resembles my existing patients that I know I'm successful.
Right.
And so that's the best place to start. But then bringing that down to as local of a geography, a drive time trade area, a county, a zip code, whatever it happens to be. But as specific as you can get, that's where we would typically advise starting to think about the opportunity before we then weigh in all those other things: competition, covered lives, area draw, demographics, traffic, and so forth, that influence is this really good opportunity for us.
Right. That's interesting. It's so important to do that. And I think sometimes it's like people just go by gut, right? It's like,
sure,
somebody's like, I have a second home in this market, or my sister, and that sounds silly, right? But we've talked about, sometimes when you start working with a healthcare, like a health system, and you're like, why did you put that location there, right? You built a $15 million facility, and it's like, no. And they're like, well, the church gave us free land,
free.
right? And it's like, sometimes the most expensive real estate is free, but it's so some of these things are like, obviously, right? But no, like people still, in today's world where there's so much data readily available and analytics, people still will step on their foot in making these types of decisions. So not just, why did you go to that particular location, but why did you go to that market? Sometimes it's like, well, it's a hot market. I read about it in Forbes or whatever. And it's like, well, maybe it's a hot market for these companies, but maybe it's not for you.
Yep.
Yeah. So, all right. So when you go into a greenfield, one of the questions that we get a lot is, okay, well, you're helping me understand my locations and my patients and those types of things by looking at existing performance, but I don't have existing performance in this greenfield, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't help me with that, right? How would you answer that?
So, yes, you can be most confident in terms of explaining performance based on what you've observed. Now, when that doesn't exist today in a market, you have to walk that line a little more, or at least go a little farther out on that branch of theory, as opposed to the rooted tree of fact, to take advantage of those opportunities. Because yes, there is risk in doing it. But in balancing the inputs of local intelligence and past experience, and just being able to know, well, if that anchor grocer comes in, and if these other providers move in, and if those housing developments that are planned continue on as expected, on track, well, then, we should, in 18, 36, 48 months, whatever that happens to be, based on your lead time and what's normal for your business, then everything should be fine. And so having that expected run rate for, if we open at this point and we're not, and the trade area around us is not where we thought it would be, how long are we willing to tread water, before we realize we made a mistake?
Yeah.
I think is the first and foremost thing that an organization needs to be comfortable answering. To bring that back to your question, though, part of how we accommodate that, because Buxton operates off of what we know and what we can prove given the data that's available. Well, plenty of clients will take what we provide and then make some adjustments. Quite literally, like, well, I know that there's not a grocery store here today, but I am confident that the sign that's in the dirt right now for coming soon is going to happen. And so we're going to make some assumptions where we bump up co-tenancy, for example, to say, well, let's just imagine that there is a grocery store here and we are getting that benefit, to see what that revised score looks like, to then make that future decision off of where the puck will be as opposed to where it is right now. And that's really the key thing in how Greenfield operators tend to get ahead in terms of their decision making and their strategic planning, when reality is, where you'll be up and operating is a pasture full of cows.
I think those are good. I also think that, and you mentioned it earlier, but just to reiterate, when you can study your patient profile or your patient population and actually create a patient profile built not just off of demographic data, but also psychographic data, lifestyle data. What that does is that allows you to translate the knowledge that you have about who good patients are in existing market into where those types of people are in new markets. Yep. And think about this, been doing this a long time here. One of the things that I'll ask at the beginning is, hey, what do you think your patient's like? What's the profile? And, people will kind of say, well, our patient makes, $100,000 a year, whatever, between $100,000 and $125,000 a year. Great. My next question then is always, where? And they always sort of turn their head like, dog, like, what? and it's like, well, $100,000 a year in Manhattan, Kansas goes a long way. Yep. $100,000 a year in Manhattan, New York, that doesn't go a long way. You may have the same interests, but your disposable income and your ability to transact on those things is very different. And so you cannot just use demographics. That's just one example, right? I've got neighbors who are the same as me demographically, age, income, children of a certain age, all that kind of stuff. We live in the same neighborhood. We live like a couple houses down from each other, but very different in the things that we do. And so you would talk to us differently. One would be a good potential patient, one not. If you're just using demographics, you'd say, yes, they're both the same. And when I go find those people in a new market, yeah, that's going to be good for me or it's not. When you can look at psychographics, it's saying, it's not just looking at household income, it's also looking at what's the cost of living, so that you can go look at a new market where it may not have as high an average household income, but you have lots of likely patients because the cost of living is lower. And if you're just looking at household income demographically, you're going to ignore that tertiary market or that Greenfield market because you don't think that there's enough there. And so that's a common mistake that you'll see, where data and analytics in the right ways can help you unlock those new markets.
Well, even with that, payer mix is baked into it.
Sure.
So you get multiple benefits by having that understanding at that psychographic level of who is my patient to be able to already answer the next questions. Well, what's the payer mix? Which of course we've got that data too, but when you know your patient profile, you've already got the payer mix question answered when you evaluate any market of interest.
All right, last thing before we wrap up this episode. Common mistake you see systems make when they think about either Greenfield or Whitespace growth, and one thing that you say, man, these clients or these people that you see, they do that right. Doesn't have to be a named example, but just, man, this is the best practice that you would recommend the viewers know about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the common mistakes, and it's a balancing act, both in terms of embracing Greenfield development or shying away from it, is having a trusted network of partners across multiple companies and multiple parts of the country to be able to give you their best professional opinion about, here's what I think about this particular opportunity in terms of the degree of confidence they would place on it. And, if you just stack them all on a good old fashioned T-chart and see, well, how many fall on one side versus the other, I think that goes a long way to helping to inform, what should I do? And if the analytics are good and the local intel is good and everybody else, recruitment, the numbers may look good in the market. Can you get somebody over there to actually operate? If recruitment gives you the thumbs up, well then great, give it a shot.
Yeah.
I think that's a key thing, that just being too risk averse sometimes forces people to miss on what end up being really good opportunities when multiple inputs might suggest, yes, like this will be good if you are willing to get by before you are thriving within this particular market.
And multiple inputs being data and analytics.
Absolutely.
Is a key component.
Yeah. I will say the one metric that so many of our clients use in terms of making no-go decisions at really any geography, but again, the trade area, the most specific is going to be where we typically recommend. And if you have to drill it down to one, it's, well, how many of the right kind of people are here? So your patient profile, and then divide that by the count of providers that do whatever that form of healthcare happens to be, and get that ratio. And of course, baseline that against your existing portfolio, adjusting for density and regionality and all that. But when the executive teams we work with can instantly answer, what's that ideal ratio? Is it 2,000 households per provider? Is it 4,000 households per provider?
Or the right kind of household?
Yeah, yes, that's assumed, because if it's just all households.
Just clarifying.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. That's good.
Clarifying.
If it's all households, well then we don't know. But when they know the profile and they can say, this is how many of our kind of people are here, and here's how many other providers, some of which may even be their own, who can deliver the same types of services, and they have a very specific understanding of that, that's a huge step in the right direction to know, is this something that we can sustain today, next year, 5 years from now?
Awesome. All right. Well, that will conclude another edition of Analytics Unplugged. Thank you very much.
Always.
When we get back together again, school's back in session. There'll be some college football games. I think you're gonna have. See, you can't. Okay, here's the deal. When we come back the next time, you can't just keep trimming the beard. It has to be, you either shave it or you go full like Grizzly Adams. So that's where we'll set the poly market for next time.
All right. Put me on the spot.
Okay. All right, Peter, thank you very much.
Always.
For Peter Healey, I'm Bill Stinneford. Thank you guys for watching.
To learn more about Buxton, visit our website at buxtonco.com.